who want to do that work. So, we believe you shouldn't need a PhD to be able to write for or interview for or even just read ROMchip. Okay, all right. And these Twitch talks that we do, called ROMchip Presents, are an extension of the mission to bring historical work to you through the power of live streaming. This is the second talk in a series of 3 that we're hosting as part of our fundraising season. Last week, we hosted Rachel Plotnick talking about the long history of gamer energy drinks. You can find that talk over on our YouTube channel. We'll drop a link in the chat. And next week on Valentine's Day, we'll be chatting with Braxton Soderman and Tom Bolstorff about their new book on the Mattel in television. All of this leads up to our 12-hour Twitch fundraiser that we'll be having right here on Saturday, February 22nd. Put it in your calendar right now. And the reason we fundraise is because nobody's paying for any of this. The vast majority of journals, even open access ones, are owned by for-profit publishers. Those that aren't survive on grants or are the research funds of the academics who run them. And we think those models are a recipe for austerity and negative growth. We think we'll never live up to our potential if we have to do what a publisher tells us to do, or if we're limited by the financial whims of our bosses or currently our government. But what that means is that we have to find our support from folks who, like you, who enjoy our content and support our mission. When we did our first fundraiser last year, we knew this was a gamble, but we tried it anyway, and we were overwhelmed by the support we received. We hit our highest fundraising goal, and we've been able to do amazing things like fund new translation and history work, which are going to be published in our journal this July. So we know that this community can bring it, right? Our goal on February 22nd is to raise at least $7,000, which will help us continue bringing you all of this incredible work, including talks like these. We're planning a whole day of game streaming content with folks like Jason Scott from the Internet Archive, game designers like Merritt Kay and Paolo Pedrosini, Phil Salvador from the Video Game History Foundation, I know he's in the chat, speedrunner Tina Hacks, Holly Nielsen, Sharon Biswas, Pat Lemieux on the modular synth, Colleen Macklin talking about the trans vibrator. We've even got the furry butt plug engineer QDOT. It's going to be super stupid and you're going to love it. So if all of that sounds awesome and you can't wait to join the fun, you can also help us right now. As of this moment, we are 31% toward our 7K goal with 15 days to go. Momentum matters a lot in the early days of a fundraiser. The closer we are to 7K, the sooner we can unlock those higher fundraising tiers when we get to the actual fundraiser day, right? And every extra dollar we bring in is dollar that goes back to authors, translators, tech specialists, stuff like that. As a bonus, if you donate right now, you get our early donor perk. You'll get your name on our donation website, a little bit of ROMchip swag, a personal thank you from myself. So if you want to know more about our fundraising mission, or if you just want to get to donating, links in the chat, donate.romchip.org. Okay, with that spiel out of the way, it's my honor and pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Jesper Juul. Come on in, Jesper. There we go.
Thank you. Thanks, Laine.
I got it, man. Jesper Juul is an associate professor at the Royal Danish Academy of Architecture, Design, and Conservation in Copenhagen, and one of the most prolific and long-standing game scholars in the field. His early monographs like Half Real, Video Games Between Real Rules and Fictional Worlds, and A Casual Revolution, Reinventing Video Games and Their Players, I think it is safe to say, Canonical Texts of Early 21st Century Game Studies. And he is also the author of The Art of Failure, an essay on the pain of playing video games, and Handmade Pixels, Independent Video Games, and the Quest for Authenticity, all released by MIT. Jesper also co-edits the MIT Press Playful Thinking series. But today we're here to appreciate Jesper's latest book in his turn toward history with Too Much Fun, The 5 Lives of the Commodore 64 Computer. Taking on the up until now under-regarded history of what was the best-selling computer platform in the world. We've needed a book like this on this subject for a long time. It's my pleasure to welcome Jesper to share his work on that today. And one more thing before I let you talk. We've got a special discount code from MIT Press today for 20% off. Too much fun. The code is READMIT20. We'll drop links in the chat. Snag this book today for less than $25, thanks to our friends at MIT Press. And with that, welcome, Jesper, and I can't wait to hear you talk.
Thank you, Laine. So thank you, Laine, for this opportunity. I really enjoy ROMchip, the journal. I know it's a lot of work to do it, and I appreciate it. Yeah, as Laine says, the title of this talk and the title of the book is Too Much Fun, The 5 Lives of the Commodore 64 Computer. I'll explain what that means more specifically. So this kind of came about because I was asked by the Platform Studies editors, Nick Montfort and Ian Bogost, if I considered writing a book about the Commodore 64, because they knew I'd kind of worked with it a lot. And I kind of waited 10 years after, at least 10 years after they asked me, because it had been like a really intense part of my own life. So as a late teenager, I'd been kind of programming and playing games on it. I'd been kind of sitting up late all at night. I'd been going to these kind of parties where we'd kind of sleep on the hard floors of school auditoriums. And I kind of needed actually a bit of a distance before I could kind of return to it. And so I thought perhaps I'd write a book about this kind of specific, kind of intense experience I had with the machine. And then I talked to a lot of people, right? And then the more people I talked to, the more I understood that people had really different relations to the Commodore 64. And what was interesting was more about writing about how all of those different kind of relations and all of those different experiences came about. So, but more concretely, like this is a fully stocked kind of Commodore 64 setup, right? You have the machine, you have the monitor, like for a lot of people, this was a television. You have your printer, you have your floppy drive with your floppy disks, you have a joystick, you have your programming manual, and this one you also have a little modem on the side. So why is that important? So the thing with the Commodore 64, as Laine was alluding to, is that if you look at the category of home computers, which we'll get to, it's kind of interesting that the Commodore 64 was by far the best-selling machine of that kind of era of home-oriented computers. So like it sold at least twice as many machines as the Commodore Amiga or the ZX Spectrum or the Apple II, right? So home computer is also a little kind of weird category. It doesn't really exist anymore, but it refers to an idea in the 1980s, especially, that there would be kind of more serious computers, sometimes called personal computers. And then there would be this other category called home computers, which were kind of different in several ways, one of which is that they often had color and more games than the more serious kind of personal computers. Laine's work obviously kind of straddles that line between the home computer and the personal computer. You could also see it interesting if I tried doing several pieces of you might call data journalism or data research for this book. And one of them here is that I tried to look at using Moby games, the kind of cumulative number of games for different platforms. And you can see from 1985 till 1993, the Commodore 64 is actually the platform of all platforms, all computers, all consoles, with the most published games for that period, like for a 10-year period of time. And so, of course, the weird thing is that you can read many books about computer history that kind of barely mention the Commodore 64. You can read many books about kind of video game history that kind of barely mention it. So where other companies, I guess in US history, especially like Nintendo becomes the company in kind of video game history or things like that, right? And so it was kind of interesting to me why something like this can happen, right? How can it be that a machine like this can sort of not disappear, but at least sort of become almost invisible when people write the history of games or computers. And for me, it was perhaps especially kind of essential because like I really grew up with this machine, right? This was the central machine both for computing and for games in Northern Europe in the 1980s, right? And first I thought, like, is that just a special European thing, right? So here you see this in the Technical Museum in Berlin. There is a golden Commodore 64 celebrating the 1 millionth machine sold in Germany, right? So there even is some national pride about the Commodore 64 in various countries. In Europe, in Finland, it's known as a tasavallan tietokoone. The computer of the Republic is the kind of common phrasing, a common name for the Commodore 64. And so I thought, is it just because it was only popular in Europe that it's like this? Well, the weird thing is then if you go back and read old magazines, you'll see that, for example, writing about the first MMO, the one called Habitat, which was written for the Commodore 64, the developers talked about that in 1985, the Commodore 64 was the mainstay of the recreational computing market in the US, right? And you can also see a kind of study from 1986 saying that actually the Commodore is the biggest distributor of computers for the home market in the US too, right? And even you can also think not just of sales, but also kind of cultural mindshare. And there's a 1985 Mad Magazine spoof of the computer company president of the year, which is not about, say, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, but is a parody of Jack Tramiel, so the head of Commodore. And in this case, Commodore is called Commode, is the joke, obviously. So that tells you something about, in a way, not only the sales, but also the role in culture the Commodore 64 had, right? And so why is that not so present anymore? Obviously, this is one of the things with history. You get certain standard stories, and in this case, in computer history, it often became the history of, say, Steve Jobs versus Bill Gates, and then all other companies and kind of all other people sort of disappeared. And it's not just the Commodore 64, but even not that many people know how the IBM PC was made, right? Because even that history has sort of been kind of erased a bit in favor of kind of the Macintosh and Windows and so on. All right, but let's talk a bit about how this happened or how we came to this. So first note that Commodore was actually originally a typewriter company, and this actually becomes sort of important. To make calculators that they were starting on, they purchased MOS Technology, which was the manufacturer of the 6502 chip, which was the one in the Apple II and the Atari 2600, the Atari 400, the NES, the BBC Micro, and so on. And it's also a company that it doesn't have like this one famous like hacker or engineer that everybody knows. It's also a company that has several kind of really strange things that almost happened but didn't. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak was actually shopping the Apple II to Commodore, and Commodore didn't want to buy it at the time, right? Nintendo had actually made an agreement with Nintendo to license their games for home computers, but then Commodore pulled out. And according to this Leonard Tramiel, the son of Jack Tramiel, VisiCalc, the first spreadsheet that was actually offered to Commodore, and they refused it because they felt that all of the stuff you did in the spreadsheet, you could just program yourself, right? Because the assumption was that people were basically programmers when they had a computer like this. It also has a kind of company has a weird geographical history. It was mostly on the East Coast of the United States, a lot of the time in Pennsylvania. Some things were done in Japan. It's very popular in Europe, so it doesn't really have the geographical home that you might kind of expect or that would make it fit into normal histories. They also had very wide distribution, and they were famous for making things that were pretty cheap, actually. And we see here some typewriters and calculators. So leading that from those to the Commodore 64, there was a famous meeting in 1980 in London of the top executives in Commodore and engineers. And so here we have Jack Tramiel, the head of Commodore, and Chuck Peddle, the main designer of the 6502 chip. And the question was whether Commodore should be aiming at the business market or at a mass market, right? And Jack Tramiel decided they would be aiming at making low-cost computers for a wider audience. And this was not what Chuck Peddle thought should happen, and he actually ended up leaving the company, right? But this led to Commodore making the VIC-20, the predecessor to the Commodore 64, which was apparently the first computer to sell 1 million copies. It was like very cheap, low-cost, colorful computer you connect to your television, right? And you can think about it perhaps a bit like this. And this, I think, for me, this was one of the central arguments of the book, to say that computers are not just these things that some people like invent out of like a vision that comes to them, but computers are actually full of these ideas, more like in a way a river of time, or river of ideas. And the Commodore 64 is here, obviously. And this is what's sometimes called the trinity of like the first sort of mass market computers for the home, the Apple II, the Commodore's PET, which was like very much like a kind of business oriented machine, right? The TRS-80. Before that, of course, there are various sort of kind of other kind of personal computer-ish, right? So the Sol 20, the Cyrix Alto, the DataPoint 2200. You also have things like programmable calculators, like Olivetti's Programmer 101, your mainframe computer terminals. And so the question is like, when you make a home computer for the home, what are you actually trying to mimic? Are you making a programmable calculator? Are you making a kind of terminal for a mainframe? Are you making a regular calculator, a typewriter? Are you making like a video game device? Are you making more like an engineering device? And so that's, in a way, I think a lot of the early discussions or struggles in computer history is trying to figure out what is actually the predecessor of this thing, and what is it that computers are meant to do. And likewise, you can see then that, of course, and computers like feed into the future as well. And as I'll talk about, I think one of the central things about the Commodore 64 was that it was very oriented towards video games, and I think that definitely fed into like the history of computing and where we are today. So when they decided to do when they made the VIC-20 and they decided to do a follow-up, it was a situation where designer Al Charpentier was tasked with making a new graphics chip. And originally that chip was actually just meant for video game devices. So Commodore was selling chip to many companies, including Atari, for example. After a while, it became decided that they wanted to use a chip in a computer, right? But still, the chip was kind of based on kind of various assumptions about what a video game was. And so at this point in time, and we know they play arcade games, like top video games were basically these 2D things where you have like moving objects, and then typically you often have a kind of background of things that objects can pop into, and then you have sometimes like a world that can kind of scroll around, right? And to make that work on these kind of computers, which weren't particularly fast, you did things like making the world consist of these little characters or tiles, so you could quickly update the graphics. You had sprites, these little objects. I'll show you that you can move around. And then you had various kind of things like scrolling facilities, so you could like move the screen a pixel at a time. And you had things like raster interrupt, which is where you can synchronize the updating of the graphics with how the television draws the image. And so the way it looks on the Commodore 64, you might say that it kind of has 4 layers. So there's a background color, there's a text layer, and then there's a sprite layer, so these little things that can move around. And then there's a kind of a border that kind of covers the edge of the screen. And so this might make you think that the Commodore 64 was in some way really designed for games, but it's actually a little weirder than that. So if you look at the 3 sort of most famous chips in it, so the 6510, which is part of the 6502 family, was really not designed for computers at all. So we know this from interviews with Chuck Peddle and Bill Mensch from the team, was that the idea was that they were making a chip so simple that it was more for controlling things, right, or controlling sprinklers or things like that, and that there would be more bigger chips for computers. The chip ended up becoming pretty popular in computers anyway, right? The sound chip was originally designed for synthesizers, and the graphics chip was, as I said, originally a project for making kind of video game devices. So, which means that it's a good example of a computer, a device that's not really like one visionary idea, but actually even the individual chips all have different intentions in them, right? The different main components of the machine are actually designed for entirely different kinds of use. And to explain this, we can think of this, and this becomes more the kind of theoretical argument, is to say that to take the concept of imaginaries from the field of media archaeology, the idea of imaginaries is this idea that obviously something like space travel is imagined before it actually happened. for most people, computers were imaginary until the early 1980s. And of course, any kind of technology is often designed against ideas about future use, right? So today it's pretty obvious that something like virtual reality headsets remain something there that's kind of designed against an idea of some kind of future where we are all wearing these headsets, say, all the time, right? And so that kind of helps us understand a bit some of these, what I talk about, these kind of tensions in computer history. Like, so if you're making a computer for the home, what is the imaginary? What are you actually imagining this device to be, and what is it going to be used for? And so to me, that was a way of understanding this concept of the Commodore 64 being many different things to many people, right? And so that's the idea of the 5 lives. And the way I divide it up, I say the 64 has 5 lives. The first life is where it's a kind of somewhat serious computer where you learn to program BASIC. The second life is as an arcade game machine and as for games beyond the arcade. The third life is one more of a kind of computer subculture life where people use it in sort of ways not intended. The fourth life is the one where people worry about the computer becoming sort of too old. And the fifth life is where we are now, where all of the limitations of the computer are actually now, they're no longer a problem. They're actually sort of fascinating. They're kind of enjoyable and have a kind of eternal positive quality to them. And so these are also all kind of different answers to the question, like, what is this machine? Let's talk about the first life. So, like when the Commodore 64 came out, it was definitely promoted as this kind of very serious computer for the family, for the business, for education. And in this case, the Commodore 64 is really it's part of the basic programming tradition, and it's sort of this kind of multi-purpose device where video games are not necessarily that central to the way it's being discussed. Still, because you can program the Commodore 64 in BASIC, it was actually part of this whole history of basic computer programming, or basic game programming. Um, David L., he actually wrote a book already in 1973 with a collection of basic computer games, which would you then type in on your mainframe device, probably at the university, for example. And this is I'm showing here is the basic microcomputer edition of games. And so the paper was obviously like a pretty central distribution method for games at the time. And also well, actually, so John, one thing to know is that BASIC has a bit longer history, right? It's originally from, say, 1962 to 1963 at Dartmouth as a programming language meant to make computers accessible. And this is John Kemeny and his daughter apparently at a terminal programming in BASIC. So when you take the Commodore 64 home, one thing you get is the Commodore 64 microcomputer manual. And so one of the things you learn is first you turn on the machine and you learn pretty quickly. And so this is like an emulator, obviously. You can do kind of things which were kind of pretty amazing at the time, like even like adding numbers. And then obviously the manual says you should print Commodore 64 over the screen on the entire screen, but obviously you just pick your own name, right? And then you do like this, and then you'd fill the screen with your own name. And this is sort of thing people do in classrooms and stores and so on. And so there's all these kind of things you can do. You could change the background color and so on. And then the Commodore 64 has this very nice sort of full screen editor and these kind of interesting graphical characters. So one thing that you could do pretty quickly is to start sort of drawing simple images using these kind of predefined characters. So if we look at what the manual says, it actually says something that's a little interesting, right? It says it's the best home computer available today. You can use prepackaged programs, but you can also learn to program. And so like we are half a page in the manual before it explains that you can use sprite graphics to make games in this computer. And so that's clearly apparently what the writers of this manual thought was important, at least, right? And so we can load a program, and so see these are the sprites as I talked about. And so one of the things you can do is you can you can change the position of a sprite. And as you can see, the sprites sort of exist kind of separately from the text. And this is part of the reason why it was kind of pretty easy to actually make games and make movable objects. And this is much harder on computers which didn't have something like sprites at the time. The problem was that games were actually kind of controversial. So there's a quote from Klaus Schmidt from Apple in Germany, who talks about these stupid games that brought computers into disrepute. And there's a really interesting quote from John Scully of Apple saying that Apple is not selling home computers, but computers for use in the home. And it's like, what does that actually mean? Well, the journalist writes about this idea that the home computer at this point is becoming associated with kind of low-end, a kind of game-oriented device. And Apple and many other companies kind of wanted to be something more than that, right? They didn't want to be just making game machines. We can also see that even Commodore, even though the Commodore 64 clearly has all these kind of game-oriented features, the early advertising tries very hard not to lean into that. So this is the famous that we promised you won't use the Commodore 64 more than 20 hours a day advertising, which has this public service announcement thing. It's 6 a.m. Do you know where your husband is? This kind of scary questions. And then what it kind of explains is that what this computer does is kind of keep the whole family safe together like 24 hours a day. And of course, it seems to be addressed as the mother of the household, right? So it's kind of interesting as a sort of family device, right? You can also see a few other things. Dad apparently doesn't get enough sleep, I'd say. But then there's this kind of office software, homework, kind of educational games, cookbook, and the only person who actually plays a regular game is the young man of the household, as we'll see becomes a kind of bit of a pattern, right? You can also see it in the German advertising for the Commodore 64, who introduces you to the wonderful world of science. It means, and then it says like very small, like all the things you can do, and then it says you can even play video games on it. And so this is a general tendency that Commodore would explain or focus on all the serious uses of the computer, and then have the video games as a bit of an aside. Let me show you an Italian ad for this as well. Oh, you don't? Oh. There we go. Oh, sorry, yeah. So anyway, it's like you can use the computer, the Commodore 64 for work in the home and for studying, and then it has at the very end it says and jockey, like you could also use it for playing. So this was even like I think the most like the early advertisement that was most focused on games. So the Second Life, in a way, is I think what the Commodore 64 is most famous for as a game computer. And so in this case, the Commodore 64 is imagined to be a gaming device, right? It brings the arcade home, but also allows you to play new games that you couldn't actually play, that you couldn't play in the arcade. And so like this, you get new magazines like Zap 64 and so on. It's also worth noting that the Commodore 64, and this is one of the things I kind of tried to figure out in the book, that it has a specific trajectory, right? That it came out just in 1982, and if you look at, again, like using something like Moby Games, a number of games published per year, you can see there's an early peak in 1984, and then there's this kind of gradual fade out. But you still have commercial games being developed or published until like the early 1990s, especially in Europe. And so I think it's also worth noting that, as we all know, there's a famous default history of video games, which centers on the video game crash in 1982 and 1983 in the US. And saying it's worth noting that this kind of didn't happen outside the United States, right? It didn't happen in Japan because it didn't happen in Europe because people weren't by and large not using that many consoles. And to some extent, it wasn't happening that much in the US, right? Because you still had the whole area of home computer games, and that whole industry still kind of existed throughout that entire period, right? So also of the developers I talked to, the home computer software developers I talked to, this wasn't a thing. Like there was no particular crash for them, right? And then it's just worth remembering that even big companies like Electronic Arts and Activision, they were making games for home computers, including the Commodore 64 at this time. I mentioned the disconnect between, I think, those big story histories and my own experience. And Nintendo is a company that's very good at publishing how the sales figures for the different consoles. And one thing you can see here is that, all right, so the first Nintendo was really popular in North America, not so much in Europe, this is mostly Europe and Australia and New Zealand. Same thing with the Super Nintendo, same thing with the Nintendo 64. And it wasn't actually until the Nintendo Wii in 2006 that Nintendo had a big home console hit in Europe. And I think perhaps this explains perhaps some of the discrepancy between the way video game history is sometimes told in the US and the way it kind of feels or sounds in Europe. They're just very different experiences. Nintendo just did not have this role in Europe that it had in the United States. So let me talk a bit about, as I said, there's many games, at least 6,000 games were published, so I can't cover them all. But let me just talk about a few kind of trends which I feel are kind of interesting. So this is the game Hubba Bubba by Jeff Minter. There we go. The thing about Hubba Bubba is that you're basically a British person who has to mow your lawn, and you do this by borrowing the lawnmower of your neighbor, and then there's a dog that attacks you, and then if you get into the flower beds, your neighbor gets even more angry and so on. So I think this is to me a very kind of characteristic kind of early 1980s European, especially UK game, which has this kind of combination of something sort of very mundane and something very, very surreal. Another kind of even more extreme example is the game Bozo's Night Out, which is basically about getting to the pub and getting drunk and then going home. And what happens in the game is just you become increasingly drunk, and in the end there are these kind of pink elephants which attack you. What I like about this is the kind of the incredible sort of non-heroic aspect of these games, right? You're not saving the universe. You're doing something much smaller and not particularly glorious. You also have kind of interesting kind of offbeat media properties, like there's a full kind of Frankie Goes to Hollywood game, for example. I also think there's a large kind of history of action adventure games on the Commodore 64. So you have something like starting with, say, like Manic Miner. This game, there's actually a lot of sort of coal miner inspired games on the Commodore 64. I think games like Son of Blacker. And so this is like where the interesting thing for me was that in the early 1980s there was a full kind of European action adventure tradition, which kind of predates sort of action adventures on say Nintendo, for example. And this part of it partly due to the kind of scrolling facilities at the Commodore 64. On the Commodore 64, you could do these games where you had a larger world that you moved around. You could also see how this was actually a pretty new thing. So that something like the manual of this game, Son of Blacker, it would explain to players that you were only seeing like a small section of a larger map. And so one way to think about it is that just like there weren't actually that many machines of the time that actually had facilities for scrolling the screen around in hardware. The Atari 8-bit, this Atari, none of these computers were actually designed for moving kind of around a larger world. It was only really the 64, the Nintendo, the Amiga. And now today, obviously, a computer can do that. But it was at that point, it was something that people weren't necessarily designing for, right? I should also say that kind of music was a pretty central part of Commodore 64 culture. So this is one of the more famous pieces of music, Munchie on the Run, by Rob Hubbard. I'm not going to play all of it, but you could even see the thing that even if a game like a UK magazine like Zap 64 actually not only had a game chart, they even had a music chart. Where people would write in their favorite pieces of music currently, regardless of where it appeared in. So the Commodore 64 was also served as a kind of platform for distributing music, sometimes kind of ripped or taken out from the games they were in. So one thing of the 64 then is also that you can look at the different charts from different countries and see that, again, talking about discrepancy between different histories, that in 1985, the UK chart had machines like the Spectrum and the Commodore 64 and the Amstrad, and the US chart had the Apple, the Atari, the Commodore 64, IBM, and Macintosh. And you notice actually like this, the platforms are actually completely different. The only machine that's actually popular in both charts is the Commodore 64. And I think also we forget just how different those cultures were, computer cultures were at the time. So sort of perhaps wrapping up the game part, I'll say that the Commodore 64's game legacy, and I think for ROMchip we can talk about this, is, well, the original SimCity was designed for the Commodore 64. And again, it was designed based on the previous game by Will Wright, which was designed around the scrolling facilities of the Commodore 64. So the hardware facilities of that machine was actually central for the way SimCity came to be. And we can also talk about how a game like Grand Theft Auto was somewhat inspired by a much earlier Commodore 64 game called Siren City. So one of the GTA developers talks about how he used to play this. There's a whole tradition, I think, of open world games, and for the action adventure games based on the scrolling facilities I just talked about. And so I think actually that there's a pretty large kind of footprint on kind of game history from the Commodore 64 for those reasons. And some of those reasons are just basically coming from what the hardware enabled people to do. Just wrapping that up to say that, well, towards the end of the 1980s, especially in Europe, Commodore warmed up to promoting the machine as a game platform. So this is a Swedish ad which says, "Where have you been out? What have you done? Nothing." And then the Commodore 64 is the better alternative. So apparently it prevents kids from hanging out on the street because they can be home playing video games. So video games became a much more positive thing in Commodore advertising. Doing the other lives a bit more quickly. So the third life against attentions was that you started having a bit of more computer underground of people doing both, of course, software piracy, but also doing demos, which were like audiovisual programs designed to kind of do tricks that were unexpected. So it turned out that you could actually do a specific trick and make the computer show graphics down here and in the border. And this was sort of mind-blowing to people who'd been used to just looking at this light blue border all the time. And so that became a kind of culture of its own around coming up with new tricks for this machine, of finding new ways to do tricks that everybody knew in a way had been impossible. And so this created this kind of expectation of a machine that could keep doing more stuff, right? So in the book, I write more in big detail about a specific party I went to in 1989. And this is me here in the blue shirt. And so this was like 400 kids, almost exclusively young men, meeting in a school and then doing these competitions. You had to submit a demo, and then there was a voting system. And then this was the winning demo, one which is focuses very much on the kind of technical tricks. This was the demo I worked on, where we tried to be a bit more kind of designed, and also try to kind of do call outs to our favorite bands and this kind of thing you do it when you're a teenager, right? We became number 3, like this was the winning demo. I'm still marginally bitter, but I think that's okay. And so one thing then you can then see is that like this whole demo scene is actually surprisingly organized, right? So to run the party required a lot of organization, and they formed an association to be able to rent a school. There's all of these photocopied scenes, which actually have all these kind of very detailed charts every month. there's all this kind of gossip around who's in which group at what time. So actually, the material you see, which from the demo scene, is much is not particularly technical in the writing. It's much more about social status and hierarchies and so on, and gossip, which to me is kind of super interesting. So let me. All right. So, and also just say that we can see that the kind of center of this culture was sort of in the northern countries, Netherlands and Germany, in terms of just measured by the total output. All right, so going quickly through the fourth life is the one where you start feeling the Commodore 64 feels old. There are newer computers, and you get something like the GEOS interface, which emulates the Macintosh, and you get like the Commodore 64 version of the Amiga hit Lemmings. And so this is a kind of time of worry. And then you get to what's much more like where we're in the current time, that the Commodore 64 is so old that its flaws and limitations are actually now fascinating, right? And so now, if people earlier were trying to do the perfect Commodore 64 version of Lemmings, now sometimes people do something even simpler. They just make Petsky Lemmings using the simple graphical characters. And you have an artist like Rachel Myers, who's doing artist performances using the kind of graphical characters and of the Commodore 64. You have something like like these kind of weird musical instruments. So this is in a state now where like the Commodore 64 can be virtualized and emulated. So now there's a lot of fascination with the physical machine itself, right? And so Linus Åkesson here does these kind of really interesting and very difficult to make instruments using the Commodore 64. And here two combined with floppy disks to make a bellows and to make a kind of chromatic-ish accordion. And so that's the 5 lives of the Commodore 64, right? I think it goes from, it's a serious basic computer for the whole family. It becomes a game machine. It's a ticket to a kind of computer underground culture. It becomes old and people worry about whether it can keep up with newer machines. And now I think we're in this phase where like all of its limitations are actually fascinating, right? So there's something we celebrate. We celebrate that it's slow and that it has big pixels and so on. And so I think to me, it's just important to say that there actually is a history of technology beyond when it ceases to be produced. And so you might say, just to think what are the points of this book? So one is just to write about a machine that I felt had really not been properly covered. And I tried to do what some people call like the biography of technology, like talking about like how even though the Commodore 64 wasn't actually upgraded, it didn't actually become faster or gain more memory. Like there's always the assumption that it would be replaced by something else, but it did feel like it changed during all of those years it was produced, the 12 years from 1982 to 1995. But it also felt like it changed afterwards, right? And so to me, that was an interesting way to approach it, to think about like how an unchanging machine can feel like it changes, right? But the point is also that I think it's not just that people make up stuff or kind of invent the machine. The machine also, from my perspective, kind of participates in this. And sometimes there might be glitches and nobody anticipated, and then it turns out you can actually use them for different ways, in different new ways, right? And so the glitches of the machine also participated in something like demo scene culture. The machine was pretty flexible. It had obvious flaws like a slow disk drive, and then there came a cottage industry of people who'd fix these obvious flaws. So the typical example is something like a lot of people had this kind of cartridge you could plug in, which were originally made for games, right? But then that would speed up the computer and make your quality of life better. Well, it was cheap, and I do think that what's basically the point is that the Commodore 64 brought fun to computing, and I think it's been ignored exactly for that reason, right? It was too much fun for many kind of historians. But it also teaches us that technology can have many lives and live way past its intended lifespan. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Hello, thank you for that, Jesper. How's it going?
Good. How are you?
Awesome. That was a treat to listen to, and exciting enough that we've already got some questions in the chat. Folks should feel free to keep posting them. I'll share them with Jesper as we go. But first, we've got a question in from Billy Bagara. Billy asks, I've always been enamored with Ron Hubbard and his rich compositions for C64 games. I see him as one of the first to add a serious effort to music as being an essential part of the home gaming experience. And Billy's just wondering if you could talk more about kind of music, does this come up in the book? Kind of, do you have like a particular perspective on how music works, and any thoughts on its influence?
Yeah, sure. As I said, it's kind of interesting that you had, like, this is prior to MP3s, right? But you did have, so like, piracy was kind of endemic on the Commodore 64, right? So, but if you got floppies with say like pirated software, often you'd get like collections of music as well, right? So this was a music distribution platform on its own. I do also think that music had this kind of special function. There are a lot of games that were just way too hard, for example, or weren't that great. And then the music, in a way, tended to tie things together. There are a lot of games that people remember for the music. And then also say that Robert Yanis, who designed the sound chip, he wanted something that was on par with synthesizers, right? And so he was kind of inspired by like late 1970s kind of synthesizers. So some people tell me the chip is pretty close to like late 1970s Roland synthesizers. So there's certain things you can do. It's also designed in a way where, for example, you have other sound chips where there's an idea that there's a drum kit, and then there's like a sawtooth sound, and then there's a sine wave. And so they have an idea of what the instrumentation is meant to be. And the Commodore 64, it's up to you to decide, and you can change the waveforms on the fly. And this gives a lot of flexibility. You might say that there's not a lot of decisions about what you're supposed to use the sound chip for. And I think that means gives it its flexibility. And also that they originally wanted like way more voices. There's only 30, that they wanted 32 voices on the chip, and it ended up having 3, right? But that means that in Western music, you always need kind of 4 voices at the very least. So that means that's why you get this kind of very intense arpeggio style kind of Commodore 64 music with to establish the chords. So in a way, the Commodore 64 sound comes very directly from that limitation, actually. And so, but like, in a way, it was super central for the machine that it had that, and the people still listen to C64 music on YouTube, for example.
Oh, very cool. Fiction Control, who I think is Clara Fernandez-Vara, asks, the Commodore 64 was one of the few home computer platforms released in North America and Europe, as you obviously talked about. Have you observed any differences on how the computer was used in different countries? And then in parentheses, they say, apart from the British surrealism or video adventures. And I might add to that, in addition to differences in use, I would be curious on your thoughts on differences in the way it was marketed, either between the US and Europe or even within Europe.
Yeah, so we take the last thing first. So Commodore didn't have a global advertising strategy, which was a little weird, right?
Interesting.
And so, but like in the early days, like this idea of the computer that was kind of serious with some footnote about games, that was kind of universal. The Italian ad I showed you was the one that had the kind of biggest call out to games. But then then in the later life, then the European European Commodore distributors actually warmed to games. And so I think I showed a small picture. So you had things like the Batman pack. So you get a Commodore 64 with a Batman game, or with like a soccer game or something like that. So in the Europe, that became much more part of the marketing. That wasn't really a thing in the US. Also, I think that like the German Commodore 64 culture was super technical. So I've written a lot about this German magazine called 64, like 64. And so that is full of like these really complicated tricks from the demo scene, and even reports on the demo scene. And the UK SAP 64 actually kind of tries to, at the beginning, says it doesn't want to write about programming, but ends up doing it anyway. The North American magazines, they write a bit about programming, but not about the demo scene. That's not like a thing that's on the radar. But there's this kind of interesting difference. Like the European magazines all have these kind of pokes. So these are kind of cheats. You type in something that changes, modifies the program. And most North American magazines don't do that. So there's something kind of interesting about, but yeah, the European culture being a bit more technical or a bit more kind of underground, kind of friendly. I'm not sure why that is, but that does seem to be kind of pretty clear. And also, I think generally speaking, a bit generally, there's some, especially in the late 1980s, there's some, and early 90s, there's many more like these kind of action, fast-moving graphics games from European developers than from US developers. Why that is kind of interesting question, but certainly that I think that those are the big differences between those two cultures.
Cool. Obscuratory, aka Phil Salvador at the Video Game History Foundation, asks, given how important the C64's role in early home computing was, why do you think the C64 has such a relatively small profile today, not just in game history, but in computer history, compared to the Apple II and the IBM compatibles? I also have an answer to this question, but I'm going to let you go first.
Yeah. I mean, I was alluding to a few things. So one is like the too much fun point, right? That I think if you also even look at journalism, people kind of serious journalists would rather write about a more serious computer, right? At that point in time, there was remember like for a long time, like IBM PCs and Macs for that reason were black and white, right? So even having color was considered kind of somewhat dangerous for the status of a computer. So I think for that reason, it was considered perhaps unserious, right? And you might say today it's kind of obvious that a computer or phone can play games and has lots of graphics and color and sound and things that move fast. But it was kind of controversial at the time. So I think that's one reason. The other reason I think was also the East Coast thing that if it had been a Silicon Valley company doing exactly the same things, I think it would have been like journalists would just be drive by and talk to people and so on. I think that's a kind of West Coast heavy history writing, right? And of course it kind of misses that. And then also I think that it was more popular in Europe as far as we can tell. And that means that actually there's no one really owns it, right? There's no country where it's really the home computer, you might say, right? So I think that'd be my reason.
A great point. Like born in the US, but like dominantly popularized. I mean, popular in both, but like I think holds a larger chunk of the cultural memory in Europe.
Yeah.
And so like who wants to take this console and declare it part of their like cultural heritage, basically.
Yeah.
I think of it as sort of like there's an answer to this that's about how computer history is done, and I think there's an answer to this that's kind of about computing as a market in America in 1984. And the computer history part is like, computer history has traditionally been a very kind of institutional history. So, it's like bound up in institutional corporate archives. It's very focused first on the mainframe era, then the mini computing era, and disavow it. Obviously, right, games are not a market in that kind of space. And in the earliest, in the kind of, the 21st century works that do wind up writing about things like the history of software, like Martin Campbell Kelly's From Airline Reservations to Sonic the Hedgehog or whatever, right? Like games are just considered because they weren't about exemplifying certain principles of software design and things like this. I mean, they were in their own ways, right? But they not in terms of the way historians of computing thought about what was important. They wind up getting kind of all lumped together as just like this market category we're talking about, but isn't figural to what computer history is. And it's a bias inside of computer history, which is also a domain that I think until very recently has really struggled to tell cultural histories about computing, right? They joke in like history proper that like 40 years has to pass before you can talk about something as historical. And so really like personal computing only kind of just got there, right? And so I think we will see a kind of reorganization of the way computer history is told now that we have so many more people actually attending to these things. In terms of like the American computing market, the thing I would say is that 1984, which is when the C64 comes out, is I would say in a really strict sense, is no longer the early home computing era. Like that, we've talked about the video game crash, but in the US software market, there's the software shakeout where basically all of these major computer software publishers for the home market dominantly go under. And by 1984, the idea of the home computer, that there is a market for home computers, was considered a business failure. Like there were articles written in things like InfoWorld and other magazines that were basically making the case, listen, we don't have a good reason for a person to actually own a computer unless they have a small business. And so games were no one would ever make the case to own a computer to play games. And so 64 shows up in this really interesting time that's kind of a dead zone in home computing history in the United States, and you don't really see a market interest come back or really large scale investment interest come back until the late 80s. And it really isn't until like ISPs like AOL that the idea of a home computer begins to deliver on the promise everyone was making in the early 80s that never actually happened during that decade, right? So,
but I think it's also, especially in the UK, people have also been writing about this particular problem that users knew that one thing you could use computers for were playing games, but it was very hard to justify buying a machine on that premise, right? So I think its compute has a type-in word processor, and then this is, it's like I think 1985 or 1986, and there's a long article explaining why word processor is a good thing and why word processors actually justify computers. So that's
like, just spend $50 and buy a word processor. Like, why would you?
It's all fun typing it in yourself, obviously. No, that's an interesting point. That's also, I think, a bit of a difference. I think this is Gleb Albert's point, is that when the Commodore 64 came out, the U.S. software industry was kind of older than the European one. So if you read articles about the European software industry, it's like these 17-year-old guys and 18-year-old guys who have sports cars, and so that was like the whole way it was being written about. And then also that meant that piracy, that the software pirates knew the software developers, so they might sometimes be the same person in Europe, and where in the US it was a bit more, those things were a little more apart, I think.
Yeah, I think we had the kind of rockstar programming moment in like 81, 82. And then it like totally dries up, and a lot of those guys, you never hear from them again. They just kind of disappear off the face of like game and computer history entirely, because the software shakeout just like cuts, like just basically kind of hamstrings the entire industry. How did you folks are still welcome to drop questions in the chat, but I will cap one off, which is like, this book is a kind of growth transition for you in terms of the sort of subjects you've written about before. I was wondering if you could just kind of talk about the experience of like writing history for the first time. I think that actually like speaks to a lot of people who are interested in ROMchip too, which is, we kind of say like, we think anyone who can do historical thinking can write history, and that's an open invitation we want to have. So I was wondering if you could share a bit about your story there.
I mean, I guess it's probably, I think I always had a bit of that, right? Like I was always a bit interested in things about, say, like rhetoric and how rhetoric changed. I think the very first thing I wrote about was, say, like the rhetoric of interactive fiction, and I was interested in like how people were talking about something at one point and then talking about it at a later point. So I think that always interested me. I think what was perhaps in this one was that and I mean also like the one about indie games was also, there's a history of the concept of indie games which is 20 years long, right? And in this one, it was but it just came from this sense that the machine had been so many different things to many people, right? And then trying to think about how that can be stretched out. And I do also, actually, I mean, my own experiences, like my parents are academics, so they'd taken me to the computer lab at the university in like 1980, typing on the mainframe computer, right? And so I guess I think I did also kind of feel, in a way, think about this idea, this thing that like we have if you have a computer, right, that there's just many different ideas that
There's
go
been a
into it.
Commodore 64 sitting over there this whole time.
Yeah, sure. I have more than one. Yeah, so this very concrete sense that just that many different ideas go into one, and that you actually have these kind of struggles around what it is, right? And the Commodore 64 was just an obvious case of a struggle in terms of defining it, right? That if it was understood to be a game computer, it was hard to justify for people buying it. But at the end, it was a kind of derogatory term to some extent, right? So that just meant that this just kind of made it interesting for me to try to kind of do a very long durée, right? Like a long time scale from, I don't know, like 1970 to 60 to 1962 now, roughly, right? And the way I did it a lot was just reading magazines, and so I was lucky to have some research assistants I named in the book who said like read like 110 copies of Step 64 and took all the charts and looked at like the country origin of
cool.
different things. So I think you might say there were some intuitions for me, and then the book became a way of trying to quantify those things, like figure, well, was this how I remembered it? And some of it was, and some of it wasn't. But then there's definitely say like the sense in Europe of the US becoming less important in game software. That turned out to be the case, but it's much stronger than I thought. So yeah, so it's just I guess I like this idea of using the magazines. So Gwyn Kirkpatrick has also done this as a way of kind of gauging what's kind of going on. It's not a perfect measure, right? But it's I think it's kind of pretty good, right, as a way of figuring out how things change over time. And so yeah, and so then also, but I think also was just important. I must admit I really dislike Steve Wozniak's it's called I Was, where he kind of explains how he had this flash of insight and he invents the personal computer, and that's sort of like, I mean, like really, like there were other computers before that who did exactly the same thing, and the chips had been made by someone, and so I kind of, I mean, that's just one example, like you like the flash of inside history. I thought was
I as you might imagine, I have a lot of feelings about I Was
annoying, and just I think it's just much more interesting to see how that stretches both into the past and to the future, something like that.
Yeah, I think he like emotionally contradicts himself a lot. Like there's a story he is explicitly saying, but the way he tells the story, it's like I think undermines the kind of great man idea a lot. It's like a
but it's fine. Like I understand why.
But no, I mean the book is like very problematic. It's fine. Yeah, I mean we call that sometimes like hagiography, the hagiographic mode. I think Andy Russell has used that term when talking about the history of the internet. You know, this idea that everyone, you know, all of these people who are attached to these specific pieces of hardware enter into a kind of computer sainthood. And we don't really have that for, you know, the Commodore like kind of slips through the cracks of a story that you would want to tell that way, for sure. Yeah.
And also because and then also, I mean, you have the same thing with hacking. I also talk about that in the book, right? This idea that you have the kind of Stephen Levy version of it, where everything kind of like everything starts at the tech model rail club, or whatever tech rail club. What's it called?
The primal scene of like
like at MIT, and so like everything follows from that. It's like, nah, I'm not sure that's kind of how it works. So yeah, that was part of it. But then you might say, I think but it's interesting, like a platform like this obviously has a lot of hobby history, right? Like more hagiographic history, right? But it's more of a kind of coffee table kind of hobbyist fan histories, right? There's a lot of that, right? But not so much of the other, the more historian kind of history. It's interesting but it's fun. It's fun writing history to see how things kind of connect back and forth, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I think this book is another kind of great step on our way toward I think a kind of better appraisal of kind of what was going on in both US and Europe, right?
Yeah.
And I'm just always excited about everyone who's kind of making this contributions to that historical labor. So with that, I'm going to do 2 quick brief announcements for those of you still tuning in. First of all, if you feel so inclined, if you're like, this is amazing and I want more talks like this, throw some change, donate.romchip.org. That's our donation site, and contributing directly allows us to be able to pay the folks who help make these streams possible. And then also tune back in next Friday. Tom Bolstorff and Braxton Soderman will be talking about their book on the Mattel in television. It is such a rich time for folks kind of looking back at these, anything that wasn't consumed by the shadow of Atari. There's so much cool game history out there. That book also came out on the same MIT Press series as Jesper's book, so it's kind of a family affair. And don't forget, if you'd like to pick up Jesper's book, if he can get it into the focus screen there, you can use the code READMIT20 for 20% off, and we'll throw a link there in the chat. All right, thank you everyone. Thank you, Jesper, and we'll be posting this up on YouTube in the next couple days. Thank you so much.